Allow me to summarize the proposed transaction. You wish to purchase Bone Storm for 99 cents. Net profit to me, negative $59. Oh, please take my $59. I don't want it. It's yours.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. Every week or two, I like to bring Perch on the channel and talk about some retailer issues, specifically, maybe an article that's out there through icv2.com. This week, it's Newsarama article from Chris Arendt called Image Comics Eric Stephenson on the state of comics in 2020. Perch, thank you so much for coming in and talking more big business comic books with me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love talking about this topic, and I love getting the information out there because there's a lot of misinformation on retail and comics in general. And this article does an amazing job of not only going over that, but really presenting some good facts for people.
Yes, and this is a very long interview with a ton of meat in it. We're not going to be able to cover it all. Otherwise, this would be like an hour-and-a-half long video. So there will be a link to the article in the description if you want to come down and read it all for yourself. But it's definitely well worth your time. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is I noticed comic publishers are really, really wanting to align themselves with the success of like Raina Telgemeier, who are using completely different publishing and distribution methods. In the interview, he said, I think it's great to see that what we do still have is the power to connect with people outside of diehard fans. Now, I think it actually highlights the Image, DC, and Marvel aren't connecting with a huge audience due to their outdated publishing, marketing, and distribution strategies.
Yeah, completely. And I think there's almost a glimmer of recognition of that from Stephenson. I think so. Some context about Stephenson in general is, he's been in comics for a long time. I think he came in during the 90s, more formally. He was part of Image right at the beginning when this was going on. But he's also very unique in that as a publisher and as a C-level officer within Image, he's been a colorist, he's been a writer, he's been an editor, he's shared almost all the jobs. So it's a guy with a lot of context. He's worked with Marvel, he's worked with Image, of course. He's done a lot. And so I think, he's got a pretty good outlook on what's changed and what's happened. And one of the things he identifies in his comment, and you mentioned it with Raina Telgemeier and Dab Pilkey, is comics are not bringing in young new readers anymore. They used to. They did in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And even the Ultimate Universe brought in a lot of newer, younger fans as part of what it did. But comics are not bringing in new readers, and those places are Dab Pilkey. So there's an attempt in some cases, and I see Eric doing it too, where the comic industry almost wants to put their arm around Raina Telgemeier and Dab Pilkey, saying, "Oh yeah, they're part of us. They're part of us," but they're really not. They're doing their own thing completely outside of the Marvel, Image, DCs, and they're doing it stronger, better, and that spooked a lot of people. And you do see some of that spooked behavior out of Eric here, where he is referencing further kind of in this interview that there's a miss going on with comics, and he really gets into that with price.
We will get into the price thing a little bit more, but so the next thing I noticed in the interview, he was asked, so then back to your base, what gets you excited about the direct market? I thought this reaction was telling. He said, how about the fact that it actually exists, and I could go to a store that specializes in something I've loved almost my entire life. It kind of reiterates a point you recently made in our Phil Boyle segment that we talked about, where industry execs, kind of taking retail partners for granted, and some are even exacerbating some negative stereotypes, where he was saying he hadn't even really been to a comic shop in years until recently.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there is this attempt to at least want to reconnect with comic shops and with the direct market. I think some of the, there are some lessons being learned from some of the executives that, the comic shop, for lack of a better word, is like your neighborhood bookstore. And if you ignore it and you lose touch, you lose a connection with the industry. And that's what Stephenson mentions here. But the comment is interesting because it's a double-edged sword, like you said. What gets you excited about the direct market? The fact that it actually exists. That's kind of a weird way of saying that. I mean, I'm glad that you like that it exists, but to act almost surprised that, hey, there are stores that specialize in the core product that we sell. That's a weird take. I'm glad that he loves it. I do get some sincerity that he does love it, and he talks about, in 2018, I made a point to start going back into comic stores on a regular basis. That one thing, I'm of course in the Pacific Northwest. I'm here in Seattle. Stevenson's down in Portland. Our area, this broader, corner of the United States has a lot of comic shops, more I think per capita than most, and there are some healthy parts of the business here. So I'm, on one hand, I'm glad he's going back into shops. I'm confused why it took so long to get back into shops as a publisher. That's strange. And actually, if you chart Image's kind of almost losing the plot for a while, and really, they were banking on Walking Dead as their success metric. I think that you've got to get beyond Portland and Seattle as well. You got to go east. You need to get to Texas. You need to go to Dallas and Houston, and you need to get to Denver and Chicago and Philadelphia and some of these other places and look at what the stores are like there. That's almost more indicative of where the industry's at than, we are spoiled for options up here.
It wasn't condescending, but it's kind of weird in an interview. I can't read his body language or the smile. Was he cracking a joke but I was like, it even exists. Like, that's your main business partner. Of course, like you would think he would have had a more healthy respect and understanding of the actual retail market.
Yeah. And he does note, the one part that I appreciate in his interviews, he goes on to say, I think the direct market is a vital part of our business and it has a tremendous amount of potential. Okay, the second part of that sentence is important. The direct market has a great possibility to grow and be bigger and serve kind of the industry in a really powerful way. There's this narrative with a lot of other channels of like, oh, the comic shop itself is dying completely, and screw those guys anyway. They should die. And the fact that you've got experience-driven pop culture shops, that is a powerful thing, and we should see more of that. And those businesses should be popular. The challenge is, I do think that without better support from the publishers, those shops are going to find ways to tap into pop culture. Without them, you see the Funko is a temporary thing, but you see comic shops desperately trying to find other means of getting revenue and getting people and tapping into this stuff. Netflix announced a couple weeks ago that they're going to start producing a lot of merchandise around their properties and other things. Comic shops are going to go all in on that. The publishers need to make sure they keep this connection going and actually take advantage of that potential and not just see it as, well, it's there and they're always there for us if we want them to be. Because if comic shops find better ways to make money, they will stop with the publishers.
Talking about sales and stuff, another interesting part of the interview, Stephenson goes on to talk about sales channels. The more we can expose people to comics outside comic book stores, the better chance we have of getting them back into comic book stores, which is a great premise. But he kind of forgets to identify what markets Image are actually going to target to actually bring people back to comic stores. Did you notice that?
No, I did. Absolutely. And it's funny because he kind of tiptoes around, there was I don't want to say a big revolt, but when they first announced the deals with Walmart, there was a decent amount of comic shop retailers who didn't like that. They felt it was an end around the shop and they made some noise about it. And so he kind of addresses that point and he's reinforcing hey, comics need to go outside of shops. And I completely agree. They do. They need to get into Walmart and Target, and the newsstand to some extent needs to come back where it can. People are going to gas stations to get comics anymore or anything, but you need to find those outlets and put them in. He references Scholastic. He references kind of OGNs and what they can do there, but that's all great. So you're saying a fact. So what is the plan? And now maybe in his interview, I don't expect them to give away all their business plans, but hopefully there is an actual plan to go outside and get these new markets and not just identifying the problem. Scholastic is going to be a struggle for Image. It does not necessarily fit the content of the titles they produce in a lot of cases. So where, Walmart and Target, they're going to have troubles with that too. So where's Image going to actually go? I absolutely think that people need exposure to comics outside of shops, 100%. So it's time to stop, arguing that fact and start, how are we actually going to do it? In another part of his interview, he talks about the fact that there needs to be more cooperation between the publishers and more, putting their efforts together to help grow this industry. Well, here's the perfect one. Getting comics outside of shops, getting exposure to people outside. This is something great that you guys should be collaborating on as publishers. So are you going to do that? When?
But later he starts talking about relationships with creators. I thought this was really interesting. Specifically talking about Scott Snyder, who recently launched Undiscovered Country with Charles Soule at Image. Now, we know Scott Snyder has said that he has more creator-owned comics in the pipeline. How important is it to Image that he publish them through Image themselves and not go to another comic publisher?
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the interview, and he gets into Mark Miller as well. He's got to do a bit of a dance in some ways with these creators, where they need to basically, and he does, champion the creators' rights of talking about we're going to do good by you, and we want this to be the place where you should go. At the same time, they also want to maintain their power in the situation. So it is a negotiation. They would like for Scott Snyder to keep working with them, of course, and so they want to be very complimentary, but at the same time, they need to have their own business. So it's going to be, I think, uncomfortable for Image in the future, and I think he's got a hard job ahead of him. Where you've got Ed Brubaker and you've got Mark Miller and you have other people who are publishing through Image, and they're happy there, and he's got to make that whole relationship nice and strong and seamless for them. But they're going to get pretty aggressively positioned by the people who option their comics for shows, or if Image can't prove that they are going into some of these other markets like we just talked about, or that they are able to do more for the publishers, somebody will come along and make that case better. So I think he spends a lot of time talking about what Image does for people and that they champion creator rights, and that's cool. It's great. At this stage in 2020, that's almost a given, and they're going to have to start coming up with some other, what beyond we protect creators' rights do you want to do?
I don't know if most people realize this, but Scott Snyder and Charles Soule's Undiscovered Country is the second biggest Image comic book launch in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And that was almost entirely on name value.
Absolutely. In fact, Image did some things for them, but Scott Snyder and Charles Soule show up at the retailer summit and talk to people and really push their books. A lot of us were getting messages from Scott Snyder, not only with advanced copies, but did you like it? What could I do better? Please, he was hustling like very few. I can count the amount of people who hustle for their comics on one hand. Matt Rosenberg's probably the only other person that just gets out every single day and hustles for their book. Snyder was all over that. And so, as in terms of Image, you've got to handle this relationship carefully and not become just a throughput for these guys and their books. And I'm surprised in some ways that Mark Miller and his deal with Netflix has continued on with Image. I do expect in the years to come that will shift and there'll be some control elsewhere, but we'll see. He's got in this respect, he's got a very hard job ahead of him, I think, in terms of managing his creators.
Perfect segue into the next part that I thought was really interesting. He's talked about exclusive agreements with criminal creative team Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. Is it important for Image to make these kinds of exclusive deals in the future? Is Image going to be able to lock up their best talent, and should they be doing that?
I think they're almost forced to try and do that, but unfortunately it collides with their message. If you're going to say we're putting power in the hands of creators, and by the way, they're exclusive to us, that's a hard double message to sell. I think this is where they're going to have to think very carefully about how do they give creators things where the creator wants to be exclusive, not necessarily because of a contract, but because they just get so much more by having that relationship take place. So I think, as Image progresses and as the comic industry continues to evolve, they're going to have to get in the game of doing exclusives, but it's going to be very difficult for them just based on who they are.
All right, so let's talk about the pricing stuff. You alluded to it earlier. It was a moment of great honesty. I'm surprised he was this honest and forthright about pricing in the comic industry. He said, "I think the majority of comics being published today cost too much, especially if you stop to consider what we're selling. And I don't say that to denigrate the form at all. I think monthly comics can be a great way to experience comics, but I also think readers need to be given something more than a piece of a story or one link in a chain of events when you buy a comic book. And that's kind of the way things have been going for a while now. He later added, I've heard comments from various people within the industry that dedicated fans will pay whatever the price is. But in addition to being a fairly privileged point of view, I think it fails to consider the fact that only selling to those dedicated fans is ultimately a losing proposition.
Yeah, it's a great topic. It kind of fits a little bit with the topic we were talking about earlier in terms of getting comics other places. I agree. I think a lot of people agree with this. What's the plan now? So are you going to go about and work to lower the prices of your comics? Are you going to offer something more? What can you do? This has been an argument I've had on Twitter with a lot of people around why can't everybody just reset and charge alternate level pricing tomorrow? The problem is when you get yourself into a hole, you can't just immediately reverse time and go back to where things are. You have to have a plan to get out of that hole. So what is the plan? Comics are too expensive. I don't think anyone at this point can come up with a credible argument against that. They are. The only thing people have been able to say, and I've had this argument with Tom Brevoort very passionately, is, well, people are paying for it, so it's their money, so it's not too expensive. And that's a short sighted. It fits into what Stephenson said about you're then appealing to diehard fans who are stuck. They're not necessarily happy they're paying that much, and a lot of comic collectors feel this way. Not that they're like they feel like they're getting good value for their money, but because they feel they have no choice. They've been collecting X-Men for 20 years, and they can't stop now, even though we've got 14, 15 titles a month at this point coming out. They're just trapped. And so it creates this breaking point scenario where not only does this not help new readers come into the picture, it also just puts a strain and a pressure on the readers you do have to eventually force them out. And when you force them out this way, they almost never just slowly drop titles. They almost stop cold turkey. I've had many, many customers over the last several years who feel like the price, they come in at like $60 a week. I can't pay this anymore. And they just stop. They don't take one title out and slowly bring the price down again. That's the big risk they're playing with. He mentions in his article this book, Comic Book Wars, and that's a great book to read. It talks about kind of what went down in the 90s and the 80s. And in particular, and this is where Stephenson's being a little, he's always been a little bit more forthright, I think, with some of his opinions, where Marvel and some of the others are concerned. This is probably the closest you're going to get to a really direct, pointed comment about in the 80s, Marvel had a strategy to jack the prices on their comics from 60 cents ultimately up to about $1.25 over the course of about 6 years, no less than that, about 5 years, which is, if you think about it, over 5 years, doubled the price of comics. And at the same time, almost doubled the amount of comics they were selling a month. And this was the best way you could say this was predatory. It hurt comic shops. It hurt fans. They were shocked by that. Now, we would all be thrilled if comics went to $1.25 tomorrow. That would be amazing. But when you're used to paying 60 cents, that was crazy. I mean, that was a huge, weird
100% inflation.
Yeah, over 5 years. That's too much. So there's a big problem with price, and comics are, in addition, comics are being sold as kind of a bit of a story. The Brian Michael Bendis kind of deconstructed comic where you're getting a lot of dialogue that maybe makes you feel closer about the character. Kelly Thompson does this as well. Many of the writers have this style. Sounds good. Unfortunately, it's when you're paying $4 for this kind of, nuance of a character's personality, it just sucks. I mean, as a reader, it's very hard. You have to be completely bought in to this writing style, or it does not hook you. And as a new reader, that's not going to work.
Yeah, as a more longer term reader, someone who's invested in the medium, I have a channel, I have a lot of comic books. When I see a Wolverine #1 come out, the first Wolverine ongoing series in, I believe, 5 years, and I think it has an $8 cover price, I get resentful because I feel like I'm being taken advantage of, and they don't care.
Yeah, it does. It feels very short-sighted. It feels like the mentality behind it is, hey, this is great. We are publishing the first Wolverine comic in 5 years, and it's the classic guy. We've got Kubert on it, and so there's a lot of fan demand. They've been wanting this. Therefore, they're going to be happy to pay $7, $8 for this book because they've been wanting it for so long. And The problem is the psychology is almost the exact opposite. The fans are like, oh, finally we're getting what we want. We're excited to get back into this comic. Give us an easy way to get back into this comic we're excited about. You put an $8 price tag on it, it's just, now you're creating a big hurdle. And you do have a resentfulness of like, you kept us out of this comic. You stopped publishing this for so long. And now, our reward is a super expensive first issue. You can't mistake fan engagement and excitement for a desire to pay more money. Those two are not the same thing. And you can take advantage of some of these situations, certainly. But I would argue that when you've got 6, running to 12 X-Men titles a month, and you're bringing in a new Wolverine, you're already capturing their money. You're already, grabbing more and more out of their wallet than maybe they were comfortable with.
Yeah, feels like trying to pull blood from a turnip. like how much, another pound of flesh from Marvel.
It does. And it doesn't encourage readers. I think Stephenson acknowledges that, goes into that, and I think he does kind of then segue a little bit more toward, well, maybe the answer is more trades, more books. Okay, a lot of people make that argument of maybe this is an indication that the monthly floppy is an outdated dinosaur of a model. And Stephenson kind of references some of that. Says, well, some fans like to read their comics that way. No, most fans like to read their comics that way, not some. And so if you're going to make an argument of, well, it's okay that the prices are this way, and then we're just going to kind of shift left and focus on trades and focus on books, you're still going to have to get people to want to go into that book. And Image has a better time of it than Marvel and DC because a lot of their titles are new. They are, they're coming in fresh with a new concept, a new idea. But even there, who's going to go into a shop and say, I've never heard of Sex Criminals, but here's a trade paperback I'm willing to pay $20 for. Why not? That's going to be tough. Not every book, you can't just collect things, put them into a shop and say, well, this is going to get Dab Pilkey numbers. That's not going to happen.
So we covered a lot of ground. Like I said, that interview there was a lot to unwrap in that. I know, you took it, you read it from a different perspective. Is there something that I missed here that you really wanted to talk about?
Well, the only other thing I'd throw in here, and I do strongly recommend people go read this interview. It gives a lot of good information. It dispels a lot of myths that we hear about on social media and YouTube a lot around comics. But the other part is digital. So he goes into digital and he admits something that a lot of publishers have argued with, and that's that digital is in its infancy as a sales channel, that it's nothing for all purposes. This is something both Dan Didio and Tom Brevoort and Axel Alonso have argued with, that no, the digital numbers are great. Everybody knows they're not, that this was not truthful. So Stephenson coming out and saying, hey, it's been a little over 10 years since Comixology launched, less than that since the debut of the iPad Kindle Fire. Nobody cares about the Kindle Fire at this point, but everybody is still figuring out digital. And there's potential there, sure, but there's not money there. And it's something they want to pursue in the future. I mean, he admits, and this is maybe one of the most telling comments, is that he doesn't know if it's an afterthought, but it's treated as though it's secondary to print comics. That's true. And so there's this desire, and he goes back into it again. Comics are too expensive. Print comics are too expensive. Digital comics are too expensive. And you look at people who admit to stealing comic content online. It's because it's too expensive. And because downloading this product can't just have the same exact price as print. That's part of the overall problem. And I think that's very truthful. It's accurate. It's he goes into the health of the industry and says there's a lot of potential, but at the same time, in many cases, the overall market has been in the decline for the 90s. There's problems in the industry that have solutions, but it's going to take honesty and bravery for people to fix them, particularly on the publisher level. So a lot of good stuff in there. I could go on and on about, he talks about Hickman's X-Men and why that was a surprise. He talks about people who put pressure on Diamond fairly and unfairly for what they can do and what they can actually influence. And I just think it's a really good comment. His quote I pull out is, "A rising tide fits all ships." That's absolutely truthful for comics. But when you say rising tide, and he was referencing Joe Quesada saying this, that doesn't mean all of Marvel's books rise and nobody else's. It means these publishers have to start working together, have to start, combining their efforts, or they are going to lose this potential. Deep breath. Sorry.
Absolutely. Like I said, yeah, that was a great interview. It was really illuminating. It really helped me get some perspective. And I really appreciate you coming on here and help me break down some of the stuff that I found most interesting, providing some really good insight on that. As always, Perch, I really appreciate you coming on here and talking some of the business side. You know, you're one of my you're a good friend here, and somebody I really appreciate with all your retail insight.
Yeah, no, you're a good friend of mine too. I like what you do with your channel, and I really like the fact that I want more channels like this one. My channel's kind of boring details. You get into topics, have more guests, and I think you're doing a great thing by the industry. And we talk about potential of where comics needs to go. We need more conversations like this one, not just dispelling, not ours, but what you do on your channel, not just dispelling myths, but actually getting people excited about comics, getting people to honestly admit where the problems are. Not from just a complaining standpoint, but from a let's find solutions approach. And I think that's really good. So much love, I would say.
Well, much love to you, my friend, and I really appreciate that. You know, we're working hard to get the best content out there, and I think between Comics Perch and Thinking Critical, we're doing great stuff, and it's only going to be better in 2020.
Absolutely. Let's build this industry.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.